The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. In today's program, Amy Dacey, Executive Director of the Sine Institute, welcomes 2021 Distinguished Lecturer, Mayor Laurie Lightfoot.
Good afternoon, everyone. So glad you could join us. I first want to thank our co-sponsor, the Metropolitan Policy Center here at American University within the School of Public Affairs. It serves as the Metropolitan and Urban Research Hub at AU's campus. We'll have some more information on them in the chat, but they've been incredibly supportive and we appreciate them collaborating with us on this. I'm Amy Dacey, the Executive Director of the Sine Institute, and so honored today to have joining us our 2021 Distinguished Lecturer, Mayor Laurie Lightfoot from Chicago. Mayor Lightfoot has a long and distinguished career before she became 56th mayor of Chicago. She's worked in the private sector, certainly as a senior equity partner in the litigation and conflict resolution group at Mayor Brown. She's been president of the Chicago Police Board, chair of the Police Accountability Task Force, assistant United States attorney, so many other roles. One we're very proud of, Mayor Lightfoot, is that you are a graduate of the Washington semester program here at AU. And so I want to also reference, we did an interview in American Magazine recently with you. We're going to put that up in the chat. But I certainly had to give a shout out to Adam Anthony, the current director of the Washington semester program, and your participation in that, and I guess interning on the Hill. But first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us. We know how incredibly busy you are running one of the largest cities in the United States. So thank you again for being a part of this.
No, it's my great pleasure to be here. So thank you.
Well, yes. No, I was just going to say, Mayor, we should get right to it because I know there's so many questions as well. We are joined by a group of our students, alumni, faculty, staff, all interested in talking to you. Yes, 56th mayor, and certainly took the helm at one of the most difficult times in America's history. There was no rest for the weary as we moved into a global pandemic, an economic crisis, social unrest. Very interested just to hear your initial thoughts about, as serving as mayor, what this has been like since you took on the role of mayor of the great city of Chicago.
Well, I have this conversation, I think, quite frequently with folks, and even earlier today. No one anticipated what we've been through in the last 18 plus months. I got sworn into office in late May of 19, had a little summer honeymoon, and then started really rolling up my sleeves to address some of the tough issues that we were already facing in the city. I ran to break up the status quo and entrench interests that profited from the city mightily, but there were so many people across our city that were just being left behind, that weren't seeing that they felt like they weren't seen or heard. And particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods across our city. So we knew that we had a overflowing plate of challenges long before COVID-19 came to break up generational poverty. Ironically, in February of 20, right before our first series of cases of COVID came, we held the first ever poverty summit in our city and made a pledge to end poverty within a generation. It was a great and sobering gathering, but little did we know the challenges that we're going to face And I think we did a lot, and we continue to do a lot to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. But really, from the very beginning of that crisis, myself and my team have really looked at it as an opportunity really to right some historic wrongs. In April of 2020, I announced to our city and really to the country that in Chicago, Black Chicagoans were dying at 7 times the rate of any other demographic. Why is that so? Well, the answers lie in long-term inability to get access to high-quality healthcare that's affordable. Too many of our Black and brown residents live in areas that are food deserts, and a long-standing lack of opportunity and access to good-paying jobs. So the denial of these resources and investments compound on each other. And as I've said to a lot of folks across the city, poverty is not cost-free. When we do not invest in individuals and families and communities and have real intentional strategies for addressing and eradicating these seemingly intractable problems, they don't go away, they magnify. And then much of what we've been seeing, I think, over these last 2 years is the lack of investment really coming home to roost and magnifying itself in the challenges that we are facing in the context of fighting what I hope is a once-in-a-lifetime global pandemic.
Yeah, it's
There's no playbook for that, but we've been persevering nonetheless.
No playbook, but how interesting that, when you announced you were running for mayor, the theme was forge a new path. I mean, you were already, thinking about changing things, in Chicago to increase equity, to increase inclusion, and then to be thrust in the middle of a pandemic that exacerbated those problems. I mean, has your city changed as a result of COVID?
I think we definitely have changed. You can't go through this kind of widespread experience that's really affected every single household, every business, every activity without changing. There's changes in, I think, our appreciation for the luxury of being able to gather together, to be able to come outside of our homes, to be able to go and enjoy many of the great assets of the city, not the least of which was our lakefront. Yes. I had to shut our lakefront down for many months in 2020 because people were not understanding the dire circumstances that we were in, and that the gathering together, before we understood masking and all the other things that we now know very well, but that gathering together in small contained spaces, even outside, was putting people at risk. So the luxury of coming together, over the course of the summer, we had a lot of different events where people were coming together, mostly masked, but some unmasked. And the fervor in which people embrace these opportunities for live theater, live music, sporting events, and just neighborhood gatherings I don't think anybody will ever again take that for granted. I think we've also changed in our ability to understand that we can fight and work together against a common enemy. And a common enemy, obviously, has been COVID-19. And I've seen incredible, heroic work and sacrifices done by people all over the city. Healthcare workers, obviously, first responders to be sure, but also people in neighborhoods who saw that their neighbors were in need. You know the stories and you've seen the lines and photographs from all across the country, that food insecurity became a major issue everywhere. And it was no different here in Chicago. So the list I could go on, but I think our city absolutely has changed. I think as individuals and families we've changed, but I hope that we change for the better and recognize that we have to be united. I'm going to badly paraphrase a line from a poem from Robert Frost, which says in essence that the only way forward is through. And I'll add on to that the only way forward is through together. It's that unity that gives us strength. And I think people recognize that in a way that perhaps they didn't pre-pandemic.
Well, it's interesting as mayor, it's not only creating and implementing policy, but you're the great educator of the city too. Like as you mentioned, there was a lot of information, flowing to all of us and from very different aspects. I know one of my favorite things was one of the early public service announcements that you did, which really, it was great just because it showed, just your incredible compassion and fun side, but it also said, to your point, those things about if we're not in this together, there are things that we will miss that we're not, able to do. So what do you think your role is as the great educator in sharing information and accurate information with your constituency?
Look, I think the absolute responsibility, particularly of mayors, is to be the unifier, to be the convener. It was absolutely essential for us every day through COVID, really at the height of the crisis, to make sure that we were giving accurate information, that we were telling people what they needed to know, even if it was hard for them to hear, but also doing it with empathy and compassion. I think one of the biggest challenges that I had through the height of the COVID pandemic is to continue to inspire hope, even in the darkest times. Even if the light at the end of the tunnel was just a pinprick, to let people know that we were moving, however gradually, incrementally, but we were moving towards that light. So that was a lot, and I think we did well under the circumstances. Luckily, I have a great public health commissioner, a fantastic team, and they were very prepared. Ironically, the fall before, so the fall of 2019, Chicago was picked to do a major national exercise with the CDC and the FDA and partners from all across the country and here locally, simulating a virus coming from China that was of unknown origin. And how would we respond to that as a city? So, I mean, how's that for fate?
Yeah,
and irony.
Incredible.
But that exercise really prepared us. We didn't have the experience of a lot of places where you had to struggle for the basics, ventilators, PPE. We had all of that because our public health department believes in stockpiling this kind of unnecessary equipment on a regular basis, and we do. So while there's a lot that we didn't know about this virus in its early days, we were prepared and we worked together, and we didn't see some of the crises that really affected a lot of other parts of the country. They're affecting it now. We didn't run out of ICU beds. Our hospitals work together. Normally they're competitors, but they work together in a way that we hadn't seen before. And they flexed the space to make sure that we could accommodate and treat COVID patients. So there were just a lot of really amazing things that happened because we worked together.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Mayor Lightfoot, I think in some ways the country got a really incredible lesson or a retelling of civics, in this country, because it's like, I think we learn more about what's the role of the mayors but what do you think about, how you have to work with the governor's office, with the federal government? I mean, we also learned a lot about that interaction. How did that affect you making decisions, the right decisions for Chicago, while having to work with those different levels of government?
Well, look, we saw way too many examples of what happens when elected leaders don't work together. Our people needed us to be united. They needed us to show them the path forward and instill confidence in them that we were acting as competent leaders. I'm not going to say that I agreed 100% with everything that our governor did, but I made a determination I was not going to fight with him in public. Unfortunately, you saw what happened, for example, in New York City, where the mayor and the governor were constantly at each other. That erodes public confidence at a time when people were clinging to their sanity because they were so fearful. So we have to figure out a way as elected officials, even when we disagree, to do it in a way that doesn't undermine public confidence. And look, we remember who our president was for most of this time. We did not get help from the federal government. We just did not. But we needed to move forward anyway. The thing about being a mayor is no excuses.
Yeah.
The residents are at your front door every single day, and we have to deliver no matter what. We're the cavalry. We have to get it done.
Yeah, I would say that you've got such a direct link with the constituents, with all the other roles you've had throughout the city. Obviously, there was relationships and people knew you. In an interesting way, too, I think some of us learned. I know I've lived in Washington, D.C. for a long time, and certainly another AU alum, a fellow mayor of yours, had to navigate all this. But also, we saw our mayor here in D.C. have to partner, with the local journalism and then local news outlets. Like, how is it important to make sure that local news is a part of this conversation and like helping to get out the information that's accurate?
Well, look, the media is essential. It's the fourth estate for a reason. Media plays an incredibly important role in our democracy. But here in Chicago, and I think in other parts of the country, I think media is really going through an incredible transition. And we're not at the end point yet. The traditional media, whether it's newspapers, TV, are really struggling financially, trying to find their audiences. And sometimes I worry that they're more concerned about clicks on a website than they are about really investing and getting to the bottom of things and understanding the facts. I'm not going to be the first mayor that tells you that sometimes I read newspaper articles about things that I know about and they're unrecognizable from what I know. But having said that, we understood that people were still needed to get credible sources of information. And we talked a lot about that throughout the pandemic, credible sources. And so we spent a lot of time really reaching out to reporters and news directors to give them accurate information. We put up, and we still have it up on our city website, a series of information about barometers on where we were in the arc of COVID cases, percent positivity, all the things that we didn't know the language for 18 months ago, but as now people are very conversant with. We were determined that we were going to be a good, factual, straightforward source and encourage not only the media to go to our website and make sure that they were reaching out if they had any questions, but also doing the same with members of the public. Our public health commissioner started a Facebook Live session called "The Doctor Is In," and
like it,
really
yeah,
answering questions and really doing a lot of myth busting because there remains, unfortunately, a huge amount of disinformation that's regularly circulated on social media and taken as fact. So we do everything we can to really call balls and strikes, provide people with the unvarnished truth and information, and hope that they will use that to really help educate themselves and guide their daily navigation through this crisis.
Well, and it's interesting because that's such a resource and you have to be a firsthand knowledge for healthcare information. But also, as we said before, it wasn't, these things weren't happening separately. They were happening, simultaneously.
Oh, yes.
Economic challenges that you faced. Obviously, there also has to be a lot of communication around that. People, I'm sure, were asking about the federal CARES funds, any kind of assistance, federal infrastructure money, some of the things that were happening, around moratoriums on evictions. How are you navigating all those things that also came to you federally on some of these policy fronts on the economic front moving forward?
Well, look, you're right. Not only did we face a pandemic, we faced an incredible economic meltdown and social unrest, all within the span of about 4 or 5 months. So one of these would be enough. But the fact of the matter is we faced all of them simultaneously. And really, I think people were feeling very unmoored. But first and foremost, we had to listen and understand how our residents were being affected, what were their pain points. So we spent a lot of time. We were the first city in the country to stand up an economic recovery task force. We stood that up in April of 2020. And they gave us a report late June, early July. Again, the first roadmap. And we didn't just look at the economics. We knew that there were lots of other ways in which this pandemic was affecting our residents, affecting businesses of all sizes. So we also looked at mental health and trauma. We looked at the arts and culture. So we really wanted to have a very comprehensive understanding of how the various sectors of our city were affected, so then we could come up with specific remedies to address those issues and challenges. So that was a big part of it. But we didn't rest on and wait for a task force. Yes, we put in an eviction moratorium. We did things with landlords to really force conversations with tenants and make sure that they acted in good faith. We were seeing, for example, property transfers where residents were being pushed out with very little notice. So we fixed that and made sure that landlords had to give residents 60 days or longer, depending on their length of residency in buildings. We pushed out over $100 million for small businesses, the largest small business resiliency package of any city in the country, larger than New York or LA combined. We worked with and gave grants to micro businesses, those businesses that are 4 employees or less, because a lot of the businesses that we were focused on weren't getting the PPP. They didn't have a longstanding relationship with banks. And we wanted to make sure in a welcoming city like we are, that our immigrants and refugees were also able to get access to these resources regardless of their citizenship status. So there was a lot that we were doing, but we did it in partnership with the community. I mentioned earlier that we announced the disparate impact and the deaths of Black residents, but it wasn't just Black, it was Black and brown. So we created something called the Racial Equity Rapid Response Team. We gathered local healthcare providers, also community stakeholders, and we went deep into these communities that were most drastically impacted. That relationship that we really forged through fire and through crisis, we leaned into those relationships as we moved on to help bring testing, more education, other resources. And then when we got the vaccine, we used those same networks to help us distribute vaccines, again, in neighborhoods that have been disproportionately affected. So there were so many good things that came out of this crisis that we're going to be able to scale up. My staff knows one of the things I said throughout this, we can't build temporary scaffolding. We've got to build a foundation that's going to be lasting, that once we get past the pandemic, we're going to be able to lean into those structures, those relationships, those tables that have been set, and use them to continue on the necessary work of healing our communities so that they can become resilient.
Well, it's interesting, Mayor, because what I'm hearing and what you also campaign on is this is a long-term investment. Some of these things take a long time, but you had to balance that with immediate, and we're talking immediate necessary things. So how do you balance, you mentioned a little bit, how do you balance short-term versus long-term to make sure that you're maximizing on those things, like, investment?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is a balancing act, because you can't undo decades of disinvestment by snapping your fingers in a short period of time. I've only been mayor for 2.5 years. It feels a lot longer. Given everything that we've been through. Yeah. But you also have to play the short game too. And there are some immediate things that people need. They need, and you in the context of foreign affairs, we talk about confidence building measures. Well, that applies equally in the middle of a crisis. You've got to demonstrate to people that you hear them and that you're acting and that you're not just taking the long-term view. Nobody has patience for that. We have to have patience for that as governors and as policy leaders. But when people are really in pain and they're fearful, you've got to respond to that need. So that's why we pushed out some immediate resources. We made some changes in laws to give people space so that they weren't fearful of losing their homes, their healthcare, their livelihoods on top of everything else. So we gave them some immediate protections, but then really looking at the lessons that we were seeing unfold before us every day to really think and build deeper, lasting policy changes for the future.
It's interesting, and if you don't mind, I'm going to intersperse some of the. We've got so many questions coming in. I want to make sure that we hear from some people as well when it especially when it's in line with what we're talking about. I know Jack asked a question. One of these long-term investments you were going to work on, but had very short-term, kind of urgency, was on police reform, in Chicago. How did you, try to balance some of those long-term investments that you were going to do anyway in the middle of, like we said, social unrest, this economic crisis, this global pandemic?
Well, you can't retreat. And we've said this very, very clearly. I've spent, as you noted in your introduction, a significant amount of my career on police reform and accountability. And you can't let up ever. Even in the middle of a crisis, you've got to keep steady and moving forward. Even if the progress feels little or incremental, you got to keep moving forward. And that's what we did. So in the middle of these crises, we looked at, for example, one of the things that I saw coming into the office, not sexy, but police pursuits. Police were pursuing, driving at 80 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour on city streets, ending in wreckage and carnage. Well, again, people might not necessarily think about that as police reform, but it was really important that we not do things that were going to be destructive to communities and cost precious taxpayer dollars. We had spent in the 5 years prior to the time that I had become mayor, $100 million related to lawsuits from police pursuits. Think about $100 million and what that could do in community. So reforming that was important. Search warrant policy. We had a very infamous case here where a Black woman had police officers come into her home and search, and they were at the wrong house. So we had to reform our search warrant policy. Foot pursuits, another really important thing. Very little comes good from foot pursuits, meaning it's a dangerous time for the officers, for the person being pursued, and for community members. Because invariably, when officers pursuing somebody, they take out their gun. Running with your gun is one of the most dangerous things that you could do. So we reformed our foot pursuit policy and then continued to forge in police contracts changes that a lot of folks were skeptical about, but we knew that it was absolutely necessary to do. So we have continued to move forward. But like anything, reform is hard. It's hard, but we have to remain diligent. And in the midst of this, we just voted to approve the first comprehensive civilian oversight for the Chicago Police Department in its history. A big accomplishment. Again, very hard. Lots of stakeholders at the table, lots of negotiation that went back and forth, but we got that done in July of this year, and I'm extraordinarily proud to have been a part of that.
Well, congratulations. That's again, especially when we've seen gridlock nationally and some other things, to see, you move things forward in difficult times is so important. Let me ask you, as a big city mayor, how do you use your network with other mayors and other states? Certainly, are there lessons learned, even though Chicago's unique in so many respects? Do you try to lean in on some of those relationships to see what are things working in other places?
Oh, 1,000%. We are all unsparing and stealing the best ideas from each other. And I have to say, I'm one of the most recent mayors, but the other mayors, and you mentioned Muriel Bowser, who's a good friend, we absolutely lean into each other. They've been incredibly supportive of me from day one. We've got a great network of, I'll call it my sister mayors, and many of us, frankly, were targeted by the former president. And through that, we really gave each other, I think, a lot of strength and support. So whether it's Muriel Bowser, whether it's London Breed, Jenny Durkin, Keisha Lance Bottom, the list is long, but we really respect and love each other and come together because we are facing very similar things. The scale may be different from city to city. Some nuances may be different, but fundamentally we're facing very similar challenges, and we're learning from each other and helping each other along the way.
Well, it's interesting. One of the questions that we had from one of our viewers is kind of in line with that. There's obviously some people that you're like-minded and have worked with, but I think this is a great question. Throughout the pandemic, were there any people or organizations that you normally did not agree with who surprised you by working with you to make sure the right actions were taken?
That's a great question. And I'll take it in a little slightly different direction. What I saw a lot through the pandemic is organizations, I mentioned the hospitals before. There were people who were sometimes competitors of each other in different spaces, both for-profit and not-for-profit, that actually came together and worked together in pretty meaningful ways. Hospitals being one, some of the food depositories that worked not in competition, but in silos, started to see the bigger picture of and the necessity of really working together. So I think this pandemic really told people you can't work in isolation, you can't work in silos, you can't just be competitors. When we're in a crisis, we all have to come together and figure out how we fill the voids that are invariably going to be there.
Do you think that's one of your responsibilities as mayor, to be the great connector for all?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's a lot of power in the mayor's bully pulpit, and one of the biggest ones is being a convener.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how, like you said, various groups like had to because there was a priority for individuals and serving individuals. And I will say that I know you were known throughout your campaigns and whatnot to really being in the community and, like you said, listening. And how did COVID not letting you always do that, how has that made it harder to be the listener, to go, within individual communities to track and get information?
That's a great question. I came to work every day. And through the early days of COVID, 7 days a week, my team was on it. And we were reaching out to really understand what the needs were and to make sure that we were filling those needs, whether through city resources or connecting people together that could provide the help and assistance the community needed. But I will say that COVID dramatically impacted community-based organizations. Some of them were just devastated. They were devastated because of the infections that many of them had from COVID themselves, but also the fear. Many of them had to retrench a lot of the resources and the work that they were used to doing because of the unknown and the concern in community. People didn't want you knocking on their door. They didn't want to come to a community-based organization or a clinic. So a lot of them had to really kind of rework what they were doing and how they were delivering services. So while I still continue to go out into communities, a lot of things were obviously done via telephone calls and Zoom. Again, we have a vernacular that has grown up through this pandemic that we didn't have before, but we knew we still had to get the job done. And a big part of the work that I personally did was really connecting up with community leaders to say, how can we be helpful? What are you seeing on the ground? What are your needs? And I use this term a lot. What are your pain points?
Yeah, and the pain points, I think one of the things that's interesting, a lot of the things you mentioned for those connectors are technology. And sometimes technology can be very challenging for people in with economic,
Yes.
issues. So if that's how you're sharing information, getting information, how important was it that the city made sure people had access to technology who normally wouldn't?
Well, I'll give you a perfect example. There were places and still in our city where literally you can't get a phone call because there's no connectivity. Huge problem with broadband and Wi-Fi. And I'm glad to see that. I hope in the infrastructure bill that passes that there's a recognition that this is still an issue. It's not just a rural issue, it is an urban issue as well. But one of the things that we knew when we had to shut down schools and go completely remote, our school system passed out literally hundreds of thousands of devices, but a phone without connectivity, it's just a brick. Sorry, I'm showing a picture of my dog.
Oh, no, it's so cute. Is that your dog?
That's my dog.
What's your dog's name?
My dog's name is Hank. And my daughter says to me, who's 13, why do you have a picture of the dog as your screensaver? I said, well, when you get as cute as he is, then we can talk. Anyway, but my point is, passing out the devices if you don't have access to Wi-Fi and broadband is nothing. So we created a program called Chicago Connected. It's a $50 million program where we reached out to low-income families in our Chicago public schools and gave them access to free Wi-Fi and broadband. Free. Now, even with that though, we had challenges. We had challenges because some folks had a debt that they owed, so we had to work with the service providers to say, erase the debt, because we got to get these families connected. We had concerns with that families expressed to us that they didn't know how to access the Wi-Fi and broadband. So we put a lot of work working with community organizations to provide technical assistance and training to the adults in the household. Now, kids get this instantaneously, they know it. But we wanted to make sure that the whole family was able to benefit from not only the devices, but the technology as well. And that obviously had a halo effect on small businesses also in these same communities. So you're 100% right. The digital divide is still very real, but we worked hard to understand and recognize that, and then to come up with concrete solutions to address it across our city, particularly in neighborhoods that were most vulnerable and most in need of connectivity.
Well, it's interesting. This is obviously a part of the reason you ran and wanted to be mayor, but it's been said that there are demons that come with density, that come with cities. Can you have equity and economic competitiveness? Can they coexist in America's cities?
They have to exist. They have to exist. When, as I mentioned earlier, if you do not invest in people and families and places, though that is not cost free. We see it manifest in what we saw through the pandemic. A lack of access to healthcare manifests itself by people having comorbidities that made them more vulnerable to the pandemic, by life expectancy gaps. We also see it in violence and the need to spend more resources than I think anybody wants in policing. We see it showing up in hospitals, emergency rooms, and unfortunately in the morgue. So if you neglect communities for generations, as unfortunately has happened in Chicago, there is a cost that we are paying. People will leave, the population shrinks, the financial pressure on those who remain from an eroding and shrinking tax base is profound. So the lesson of our history is we've got to invest in people. We've got to give them hope. We've got to give them inspiration. We've got to give them opportunity. And it will pay dividends tenfold to what we invest.
So it helps with this long game too that you're talking about. I think it's people, and isn't it also like the challenge of making sure to maintain the culture of this amazing city, because some of these amenities that attract business, restaurants, museums, the theater, the culture around Chicago that draws so many people, both for tourism but also business. How did you invest and try to keep that going in such a difficult time when some of those amenities weren't accessible to people because of COVID?
But look, you got to keep trying and keep making sure that you push things out. We announced in the fall of 2019 our signature economic development program called Invest Southwest. And if you know Chicago, the South Side and the West Side are Black and Brown communities. We committed to $750 million in city dollars with the hope that we would attract yet another $1 billion in private investments, businesses and philanthropic interests. Now, even through COVID, we were still able to push out $70 million. And with that $70 million that we invested, we got a return of $300 additional million. And so we just announced another $200 million in investments, and we're going to blow through our $750 million and get to, I think, that additional $1 billion of private and philanthropic dollars, which is critically important. So the lesson here is, even in the middle of a crisis, you've got to walk your values. You've got to stay steadfast and diligent and intentional about the way that you're moving forward. That's how we've done it. And then we've got to also tell our own story. Too often the stories of urban centers is the stories of murder and mayhem. And missed in that is the nuance, but also the good things. I'm damn proud of my city. We are resilient, we are tough, we are strong, and we have beautiful stories to tell. And we need to do a better job of making sure that we're telling that on a national and international basis, but also telling that story within Chicago itself. We've got to bring people together. There's too much segregation and alienation. And through pandemic, when we had to be separate, we're coming back together, and we've got to celebrate the richness in every neighborhood.
Well, I think there's no better spokesperson than it's obvious that it shows through how much you love the city. I have to be honest, when I was doing research and getting ready for our conversation, on my count on the website, there are 35 departments in the city. Okay, that number might be off, but it's probably somewhere around there. Mayor Lightfoot, how do you lead all those different priorities? How do you try to navigate? I don't think people realize, or do they realize, how many things a mayor is actually responsible for?
I don't think people, on the one hand, I think that people think that the mayor is all powerful and can do everything. Not so. But look, you have to have a great team. Mm-hmm. I would never have survived these last 18 months by doing it alone. No mayor can do it alone. You got to have a great team. You got to have people who share your vision and your empathy, the humbleness that comes with being a public servant, the willingness to roll up your sleeves, even in the toughest of times. And I've been very, very fortunate that I have a great team. I have a great team in the mayor's office, and you mentioned those 35 departments. We have great commissioners, and each of them has really good teams. But you've got to come together. You got to communicate. The mayor, I think, has to set the vision and the tone and hold people accountable to that, and hold myself accountable to that vision. But then you got to let people do their work, treat them like professionals and real subject matter experts, which is what they are. And I'm apologizing, my allergies are going crazy. But look, communication is absolutely essential. Getting people to break out of their silos. We've got teamwork that we match up different commissioners. We match up the public health commissioner with the library commissioner, the parks, but also the streets and sanitation and the transportation commissioner. So much of the work that we do is really interconnected. And I think what we've tried to do during my time as mayor is really focus on those points of intersection and make sure that people understand how working in partnership with people that they may not have thought have anything to do with their day-to-day actually is going to make their job easier and better.
Well, this is great because this really tees up the next question, who's actually, it's actually from a woman named Jocelyn. She's a senior here at American University, but she's also a lifelong resident of Chicago. So I will say we gave her a little precedent for being a hometown Chicago woman. But I'm going to paraphrase a little. She spoke to something specifically for Chicago, but one of these issues that I'm sure navigates through all those commissioners and everybody has to think about is literally, what is the city of Chicago doing now to prevent and combat the climate crisis that will prevail, certainly in the near future? Because I can't think of an issue where that one of those commissioners is not going to have to think it's going to affect them in some way too.
Well, it's a great question, and it's absolutely one of the top priorities. Look, my predecessor dismantled our Department of Environment. And so responsibility for managing the city's response to the climate crisis, to environmental injustices, was kind of spread to the wings. So we're trying to rebuild and re-centralize that focus. But look, to state the obvious, we're a city on a lake. The lake is one of our most important assets. And yet 5 years ago, we were talking, for example, about record low lake levels. Now it's record high lake levels. We're seeing the effects of climate change every day. We have joined the climate challenge that a lot of cities are a part of to really think intentionally about how we reduce our carbon footprint in our fleets, in our buildings. How do we get greener? How do we do a better job of making sure that I'm a big fan of planting trees. We have these urban deserts where we don't have trees. But in the last 2 years, we planted over 75,000 new trees in the city of Chicago, and more to come. So there's a range of things that we are doing, not just as a city, but also as a region. We've rejoined partnerships with our regional partners, but also, and when I mean regional, I mean also our state's partners. We're part of an international consortium of cities and towns that are focused on the Great Lakes. then it joins us all together. So there's a number of things that we are doing, but really the focus has got to be on making sure that people here understand the climate crisis is real. We see it manifest every single day. You know, when you wake up and see that New York City is flooded, when you see landslides in Tennessee, and you see the number of hurricanes that are coming earlier and earlier every year, and with more ferocity every single year, the wildfires that are going on in the western part of our country, but also looking at what's happening in Europe, there should never be a question at this point as to whether or not the climate crisis is real. The challenge is, have we acted too late to stem the tide? And what can we do now, every single day, at the city level, state level, at the country level, to make sure that we are mitigating against the harm that we're seeing unfold every single day across the world?
You know, I have to ask you, Mayor Lightfoot, because you are a public servant. All these decisions that you're doing on public policy make a difference. You obviously had, through American University and the Washington semester program, early on experience working on the federal. You interned in one of the U.S. offices. What kind of impact did that have on you? And what would you tell a lot of the students on here about the role of public service and you know, if they're thinking about this during their studies?
Well, look, I got a real taste of public service growing up. My mom was on an elected school board, and in a town, it was an at-large election. In the town that I grew up in, the Black population was relatively small. So the fact that she was able to win an at-large election multiple times over was an accomplishment even of itself. And what I saw is people calling her up because they didn't feel comfortable advocating for themselves, or maybe they couldn't find the right tools and the words, but people came by our house. They stopped her at a grocery store. And that was really seeing that example of public service up close and personal was something that I've carried with me throughout my life. And then of course, when I was at AU through the Washington semester, first of all, the lectures were fantastic and really showing us a whole array of different public servants, from organized labor to members of Congress, people working in agencies. It really sparked my interest in seeing the power and influence for good that could come from being part of public service. You know, and I never thought, I will tell you candidly, after I left Washington, I never thought that I would be an elected official. And so I left Washington, D.C. I lived there until 1986. So after I did the Washington semester program, I had one more year of college, and then I came back and I lived in your great city for 2 years, came to law school, thought, okay, I'm just going to be a lawyer. And I was, and I love being a lawyer. I didn't have any aspirations of running for elected office, but I think the thing that spurs us all about public service is seeing a need and thinking about how I, from where I sit, can fill that need. And that's really started my journey towards thinking that I, as some would say, that I foolishly jumped into the deep end of the pool by running after a tough and moneyed incumbent who eventually didn't seek re-election. But then we had this scrum, it was kind of like a rugby scrum of 14 people that ended up on the ballot. And I was very fortunate to be one of the two, and then ran in a runoff. And we now know the results of that. Yeah. But it is a noble calling. And even if you don't want to be an elected official, and it's not for the faint of heart, obviously, think about different ways in which you can serve your community. You can serve your community by sitting on boards of not-for-profits that hunger for talent. You can serve your community by delivering direct service, being on the front lines and doing the Lord's work every day. But don't forget to serve somehow. That's, in my view, critically important. Nothing more rewarding. When you see people in need who are thankful for what you've done, or even if you don't ever see the people. You know, I went and packed food at food pantries and wrote notes on boxes that were going to families that I wasn't going to see, but it gave me a level of satisfaction to know that I was doing my small part to be helpful.
Yes, and I have to say, when I think of the amazing team that you have that we work directly with here at Sign to make sure this could happen today, there is a lot of ways to get involved in public service, whether it's working for elected officials as well. They did an amazing job. I don't have to tell you how great they are, but we loved working with them. As you may know, Mayor, we are university wide, so we have students from every school on campus reaching out to us. We have a question from Faith, who's actually studying at the College of Arts and Science. But her question is, being a Black queer woman, how do you navigate a system that is made to protect itself and suppress people of color? You're a lot of firsts. You were elected a lot of firsts, I think, for the city. So
well look, I learned at a very early age as a Black woman, and certainly before I embraced my gay identity, that the cavalry wasn't coming for me, that I was going to have to work my tail off and be judged by a whole different lens and standards. But luckily I had great parents who sacrificed a lot and gave me incredible strength to go out into the world. And a tough world remains a tough world. It's not easy being a woman, Black, and gay. All three of those things at once. There are people who are going to hate me just because, and are going to want to throw a lot of bricks in my path. And I know that. I'm very clear-eyed about that. But I also know that I am driven by a great desire to make a difference in the quality of life of people who look like me, who come from backgrounds like mine. And I'm never going to be daunted by the critics, and they're always there. And having worked in corporate America for a long period of time, there weren't a lot of people that looked like me and came from my background. I was often the only one in the room, so to speak. So you have to be tough. You have to know what your values are, but you also have to figure out how you navigate in a world where people are going to treat you as something lesser than what you are. And that takes toughness. It definitely wears on your psyche at times, but I'm determined that I'm going to walk out of every room without somebody's footprints all over my back. Because that's what the circumstances demand. That's what my parents sacrificed for, is to give me an opportunity that they never would have imagined for themselves. Having grown up they were born in the 1920s in a segregated South. The fact that their daughter is the mayor of the third largest city in the country still is astounding to them and to me, and I'm humbled by it every day. But I'm tough, and I'm going to keep fighting for what I believe in.
Well, Mayor Lightfoot, I think you're an incredible role model to so many young people, so many of our students. As you see, we've got some good representation from Chicago here on campus. But do you have some role models or people, you mentioned your parents as well, but like who really did you look up to as you were coming up? One of my favorite expressions is lift as you climb, but who were the people that you looked to for inspiration?
Well, there were a lot. My parents, for sure. My maternal grandma was a huge influence in my life. She was born just after the end of slavery and lived almost 100 years. So she was born in the 1890s and saw this world evolve. And I was fortunate enough to really get to know her as an adult before the end of her life. But I also looked to other really strong women, and particularly Black women. Shirley Chisholm's a favorite of mine. Barbara Jordan, also an incredible role model. But I've really been fortunate in my life to have people who have looked out for me, mentors of all races and ethnicities, and men included, that have seen something in me and really lifted me up when I needed it, and opened up doors that I didn't even know existed. So I've had a lot of great mentors along my life journey still, new people that I'm meeting that I'm inspired by. But I really try to just learn and be observant around me. Again, going back to the experience through COVID, I saw so many people that picked themselves up in really difficult circumstances. And I admire the fire in them and the determination. These were people that, some of them were small business owners. Some of them were people who just were fighting for justice, and they were undaunted. And so on my toughest days, I think about those people. And I think if they can do it, I absolutely can do it.
Let me ask you another question about leadership style, because you certainly have plans set in place, priorities that you're trying to move forward. It's obviously, when you've seen the last year, it's important to be flexible. Like, how do you make sure that you also are able to handle the different things thrown at you when you can get off course from what you're trying to do?
That's an excellent question, because when back to back to back to back crises hit, it's real easy to be thrown off your course. And again, that's why you have to have a great team that continues to do the work. I may have to respond as the mayor to a new crisis that comes up, but the work has to continue and the team has to stay focused. And so what I've learned through this last 18 months is you've got to make sure that the work continues, that you have a team that responds to a kind of pressure point and the crisis, but you also have to have a team that just keeps doing the work. I mentioned to you that our Invest Southwest, we launched that in October of 19. We had big plans for 2020, big plans. We wanted to push way more dollars out. We weren't able to do on the scale that we had hoped, but we kept doing the work. And that's a big lesson of these last 18 months in the successive crises, is you got to stay focused. You got to remember your North Stars, and you can't be thrown off, because this is now, I think, the new normal. People say to me all the time, Mayor, you've had such a difficult time and you're such a tough hand, but you know what? This is where we are. And I'm a firm believer in playing the cards that you're dealt, but not letting any crisis subsume you in a way that means you're not delivering for residents. Mayors are on the front lines, and I think people are very forgiving of a lot of things, but if you don't deliver for them, that's a death knell. So you've got to keep focused.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point to kind of move forward on, because I'm sure, were some very dark days in this past year. You did mention, though, that the people in Chicago are resilient. You mentioned that some have given you inspiration. What are you most hopeful about as we see moving forward in this next phase of, like you said, the new normal? I mean, we did a series over the summer about reimagining America, the next phase in COVID, but there are some things that are going to last with us for a while. But what are you most hopeful about for the next 6 months, year ahead for Chicago and your leadership?
Look, I think it is the resiliency. And if you'll indulge me, I'll give you a couple of examples. Mm-hmm. I came in the door talking about equity and inclusion. And I think a lot of people kind of looked at like, oh, that's really quaint. That's a nice little campaign line. I'm like, no, I actually mean it. And so fast forward, I'm hearing from those same skeptical business leaders words like equity and inclusion coming out of their mouths. And so, who knows? But I view that as progress. I see that. I talked about seeing the city beyond the central business district and really seeing the beauty in all of our 77 neighborhoods. And for those who are from Chicago, you'll get this reference. The city is larger and bigger and more complex, but also more beautiful. And we've got to see it south of Roosevelt Road and west of Ashland. And what that means is you got to see Black and brown neighborhoods of our city, not just the downtown and the north side. Unfortunately, Chicago remains one of the most segregated cities in the country. And so you make references to north, south, east, or west, you know what you're talking about. And so I'm seeing people following the lead that we have set by making investments in neighborhoods that they never would have before I became mayor. I think that's great progress. But what I'll also leave you with is this. My daughter plays basketball. She's proud to say that she's 5'8" and I'm 5'1", and that's probably the happiest thing in her life. And she's really obsessed with basketball. And she plays in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, which is a majority Mexican neighborhood. And I went to one of her games. She plays at a gym in a high school. And as I was on my way out, this father summoned me over. And you never know when that happens what you're going to hear.
What's going to be next? Yeah.
So I was kind of bracing myself, And it was a father, his wife, and the mother, and his mother, the grandma. And he said to me, Mayor, my mother wants to tell you something, but she's not comfortable telling you in English. Can she say it in Spanish and I'll translate? I said, absolutely. And the woman, who was an older woman, clearly had lived a lot of years, said to me, it's been 30 years since a woman was mayor. I said, that's right. I'm only the second. And she said, for years, I've wanted my street paved. I've lived in this community for decades, and I wanted my street paved. And you made it happen. And I tell you what, even through the darkest days, when something like that happens, where I find out from feedback by being in community that I made a difference in the things that we're doing, have made a difference in the quality of someone's life, that's what this is all about. That's what makes the sacrifice and even the dark days worth it.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that with us. I think probably one of the most important roles of mayor is advocate, and it sounds like you definitely, we know from what you're doing that you're Chicago's largest advocate, and you really are trying to make a difference. We wish you nothing but the best. We are honored, like I said, that you were a distinguished lecturer for this year. On behalf of President Burwell and myself, we are so excited when you can finally get to campus and meet some of our students and share some time with us. We look forward to that day. We wish you the best. We'll let you get back to work, Mayor Lightfoot, but thank you for spending some time with us today, and we really appreciate you.
That was my great pleasure, and I'm hoping to get to Washington, D.C. sometime soon, and would love to come back on campus. I don't think I've been there since I left in 1983, so it's way past time.
Well, there's plenty of people who want to welcome you here, so we'll make sure it happens. All the best to you, and encourage everybody to visit Chicago and for all the incredible things, like you said, it has to offer. We wish you the best. Please keep in touch, and also to everybody watching, please learn more about the Sign Institute. Go to our website, sign up for our newsletter. We'll be sharing some more information about Mayor Lightfoot and all that she's doing. Thank you again. Look forward to seeing you on campus, Mayor.
Thank you. Take care.